We planned this for a long time. I think some of you here were at the Ford Theater last night to see this played. Yes, exactly. And with sounds of nature and then real sounds of nature. I guess that's, what is that, 9-1 spatial audio when you have real nature as part of it. But Last Whispers, which we co-presented with the Ford in 2 parts last night. The film presented there, and today I think a lot of you had a chance to experience the VR, which is at LACMA, and then again after this talk, I think we have it playing again. Lena calls this an immersive oratorio, and it is, I think, as many people know, because they're here because of that, composed of extinct and endangered languages. When I first experienced it in different forms, first conversation, and then partly film in a editing room, and then virtual reality, each time I became surrounded more and more by this thing, this sound image, until I think those of you who have experienced it, it does sort of get inside you. So we're going to talk about that, but we're going to talk about some of Lena's other work that leads to it. So I think you can feel some of the themes that lead to this recent work. Of course, she's the author and director of Last Whispers, a multimedia artist now, for sure. But she has a long history of studied philology, philosophy and linguistics, and has been working in photography and printmaking for over 20 years. There's 6 of her books on photography. She's been widely published and reviewed. You've probably read about her in the New York Times, LA Times, New Yorker, Paris Review, among many others. And she's a regularly contributing artist to Harper's Magazine. Her work has been collected around the world, and we're very lucky to have not just her work here, but to have Lena Herzog herself. So welcome, Lena. And we're going to have a conversation. Having been through a little of the discussion of this work with you over time, but I'm excited to look back, and graciously you provided some images and slides of other works, and I think there's so much to say about each body of work that you've made, and much has been written and said, but maybe today we can look at it in relation to where you ended up with this piece. And by the way, they look amazing on the screen. We were just looking at some of these images, but you organized a little bit of a structure to looking at your early work based on this. So we're going to start with a conversation of ritual and gesture, which makes a lot of sense. And I remember seeing these powerful images of the tauromachia, or the bullfight. It happens to be a topic I studied so much when I did my early research on Picasso and how he would go to the bullfights. There's also death in the afternoon, the notion of the sun and death, life and death. But I'm interested in how you, among many artists who have approached this subject, teased out of it some very different images. It's the black and white photography partly, but this is a question. For a lot of this work, you dealt with the bullfight, you dealt with flamenco. These are things that are about motion, sometimes sound, and we talked a little about silence. So maybe you could talk a little about approaching a subject like this, which is all about those things, and yet you approached it with still imagery, your camera.
Embedded in these rituals, particularly rituals that have to deal with life and death in the starkest of terms, like in bullfighting, everything is stripped away. It's just life and death, and it's ritualized, and it is within 15 minutes. And it all boils down to that. And yet you have this quite ornate communication through gesture, through the suits of Filipe II. And yet it's so simple and black and white. And I remember understanding it when I was looking through Goya and obsessing about tauromachia of Goya, not Picasso for me. For me, it was Goya. And also similar emotion in Desastres de la Guerra, and this kind of sense about death, but also defying it by depicting it, defying the vanishing moment. When you depict even that moment of vanishing. Anyway, you also feel silencio. And these silencios, these moments of silences, are most significant. So when in a bullfight, during a bullfight, for example, a bullfighter loses his cape and is in the middle of a ring, faced by a bull, always somebody yells, "Silencio!" And the audience gets up and everybody's quiet because they know now the man will die. Or when there's a killing of a bull, very frequently, particularly when the bull is brave and noble, as they call it, same thing happens. Somebody yells, "Silencio!" They get up to acknowledge the bull or the man. And it's the same in flamenco. The most potent moments in flamenco are in these silencio, and they're actually called silencios. So everything builds up, and you really feel that build up when there's an abrupt stop.
And silence is only kind of materialized when it's framed by something else, right?
That's right.
And then it becomes a thing.
That's right.
Somehow. Can I ask now, in retrospect, of course, to be looking at the bullfight and thinking about that and this moment of vanishing, given Last Whispers? It's one of the first topics you took on, and of course the notion of vanishing or death and silence is evident. You know, you were there from the beginning. What brought you to that even in the bullfight? Was it the fascination with the subject matter first, or did you already have this obsession that I see through a lot of through a work about the vanishing?
The hardest thing to see is oneself. Why is it that I'm drawn to that? I do not know. Maybe it has to do with the fact of quite a few of my family members vanishing during 1930s in Russia, in Stalin's Russia. We have this picture of a family on my mother's side where you see family members, and the grandmother, the matriarch of the family, starts putting a cross at the face of each person that disappears or is disappeared. And I also grew up on the western border of Siberia, the Ural Mountains, the eastern slope of Ural Mountains. Sounds like a village, but it was 2 million people, most of them scientists. And you're permeated by these stories, by the stories of vanishings and disappearances. At the same time, I was surrounded by people who were intellectuals of the most interesting kind, geologists, geophysicists, like my father, surgeons, like my uncles and aunts. My grandmother was an epidemiologist, and she would go all the way east towards Japan to fight scurvy or tuberculosis. So there were intellectuals who actually were on the ground. So they were both highly conceptual, very well-read people, and yet reality was constantly bringing them to grapple with that. with itself.
Later, I want to talk more about this question of other or difference, but of course, you've just described this upbringing in science in a kind of northern environment, in a very different place, and this first subject matter that we're looking at, the bullfight, the Iberian subject matter, is, of course, the opposite in a way. It's all passion, it's all death present. I mean, when I think about Spain and ritual, it seems like you were right going to the opposite extreme somehow right away.
That's right. And of course, it's southern Spain. Yeah. So it's Andalusia for the most part, in Sevilla, where I take pictures. But these images were already in my head from these books of Goya that I found. And it was fascinating because both of my grandparents were at the Eastern Front, the bloodiest front during the Second World War. And they would never speak about the war, my grandmothers, even though they saw all 4 years of bloodshed and just pure suffering. And I wanted so much, there was this silence that was deafening silence. And I found this book, Desastres de la Guerra by Goya, and I started to look through it, and you remember what it
I've spent a lot of time looking at that.
You know, people with insides
yes.
carrying them. Yes. And of course, my father's mother was a nurse at the Eastern Front, at the front. And I knew stories from her friend, who was also a nurse, whom we would visit in the Caucasus, and she would say, Tatiana, my grandmother, she was a very strong woman, tall, strong lady. She would carry the soldiers with the insides out, and I would look at these Goya drawings and paintings, and I was like, that's what it looked like. I know now. But all that south, it was in my head. Right. It was, so when I came, and also I loved Hemingway, I started to read at age 6 in English. And I got to Hemingway probably by 12. And Death in the Afternoon is just this incredible, one of the best books about love. Yeah. You know, how all of a sudden, out of the blue, a bull goes monogamous. And there's nothing that you can do, no cow you can put in front of it that will ever steer him away. And also about the bullfighters and these moments of silences and how they speak. You know, I managed my way into the corrales and to the places where the Patio de Caballos, where no woman can enter by the Constitution of Spain. Now, I've been rejected a lot of times from places, but never by the Constitution. But apparently from the times of Felipe II, who loved bullfighting and, you know, was very elaborate about describing, you know, what can be done and what cannot be done, I was not allowed to be there. Finally, I finagled my way in, mostly by taking pictures of the man who ran the arena and his family of 8 children. And he loved these pictures. and I got in, and that's when I took photographs of the bullfighters. And they actually speak like in the Death of the Afternoon. So the wind is southwest.
Yeah, it's interesting because now it makes a lot of sense to me the way the bullfight ritualizes, creates in present the cycle of life, death, the violence, and the silence. It's written about, but there's so many characters in the bullfight. The disemboweled horse. But you've focused in both the cases of these of the flamenco and in the bullfights on the human aspect of it. Like somehow that is the mirror to what is human. And I guess it's interesting to me that the things that are artifice or structured as culture, and we'll get all the way to language, I guess, after your investigations of ritual, you're always asking these questions about how that's a reflection of humanness, which I think of as a little more sensory and biological. And then, of course, there's the ritual with your camera, because that's the tool you're using. Are these works an investigation? Is your camera a tool for you to see that, or do you I'm interested as an artist whether you see and then try to frame. Is this camera your stand-in for your eyes sometimes in that investigation of these questions?
Well, camera replaced the pen, because my original life plan was to be a great Russian writer, a novelist. And since I linguistically dislocated myself at age 20 to English, my English isn't bad, my Russian is remained, but I lost that sensory touch for language, for the music, for the cadence. At least that's how I feel. So camera replaced that. And the interest remained. The interest remained people, humanity in us, humanism, hopefully. And I love photography because this is the one art form where humanism thrives. It really thrives. And you feel like there's an exploration there.
And so when you make that analogy to writing, though, then do you compose these portfolios or suites in narrative sometimes? Because I haven't quite read narrative through them, and maybe there's narrative in them. And so I just asked that question because I know that story, that you started to be a writer and then found the camera. So how do you see that balance in sort of the notion of narrative and presenting story?
I took photography as a separate medium very seriously, and I didn't want to force it into an idea of a novel or a novella. And when I am drawn to something, I try to be open to that. And I do it as much as it's drawing me. And then I see it. And I think the openness to the world, to what it's giving me, to what the subject is giving me. Is it going to be a Harper's 10-pager, or is it going to be 7 years looking at Strandbeest and the Dutch sculptor making them? Or is it going to be Lost Souls, the various Kunstkammers and Wunderkammers around the world? It depends on how I feel. And also, of course, it's all on me. How am I doing with it? Where am I feeling impoverished and done with it?
Well, and one thing that seems to distinguish your work, because you do absorb the stance sometimes of the documentarian, right? That's a position one takes to be documentary photography, film. It's a framework, and yet your pictures are not. They do and don't document, and I see the through line of your concerns as an artist most deeply through them. And I guess maybe is it okay to say that you choose this documentary? That is the scientific impulse that you start with, that you have to have an objective frame, not one of sentiment or of emotion. But of course, through the process, you seem to get there. To the end result of your work is definitely not cold.
That's right. But I'm not a sentimentalist either. And I think that one of the terrible things that happened in the discourse about art, and that propaganda war, unfortunately for now, has been won, and it's very unfortunate, and that is to equate humanism with sentimentalism or romanticism. And all of a sudden, you're looking at this barren landscape, and you're gasping for air. And I think it actually has a detrimental effect on not just culture, but society. This kind of attitude, that victory had a detrimental effect. So all of a sudden, for me, there's like a perfect triptych between the diamond skull of Damien Hirst and the blow-up dogs of Jeff Koons and the golden toilet of our sitting president. Somehow it all makes sense, ironically or non-ironically. I'm not blaming Damien and Jeff for this. I'm just saying we're making all of a sudden sense in the world where consumerism and market forces are the gods. And we're gasping for air for some kind of humanity, forget humanism.
Well, and I sense that in your work too, and you're striving. So, and I think you've spoken about it, or I've heard it, or we've had conversation about this notion that this system we live in that is represented by those artworks, the zeitgeist of commercialism, capitalism, you've described as a force more powerful than sort of a constitution, religion, law, that it is a forceful frame for us that holds us back. And of course, in your work or in your life, you've also gone to these extremes of the other. We'll talk about the problematic,
right.
But as a way to get outside that force of control.
And it's an extraordinary force of control because, the biggest trick the devil can pull on you is pretend he isn't there. The anonymity of power, this kind of dispersion and, deflection, and at the same time, the projection of the demagogic we, it actually conceals power in a way that Vatican could never do. Totalitarian Soviet state could never do. Kings and queens could never do. Their power was visible. And thus it was more fragile. It was more exposed to people who could see it, pinpoint it, and fight against it, and at least not be colonized in their brains, at least know what's what.
Well, and to leap right to Last Whispers, then you can read these disappearances like the disasters of war. It's a force. It's an act of force and violence. It's not accidental and natural.
That's right. And of course, the only way that these wars can happen is when power brainwashes its own people into hating the other. It necessarily has to happen. And that's when, of course, what comes to mind is Edward Said Orientalism. And I started to read deeply into Orientalism and also conversations Edward Said himself has around it, because I'm hopping countries and photographing other people. I always sense if they have something against it, and I stop. But you can't photograph a procession in Guatemala, which is something that you saw previously, and ask everybody for permission. But I can always feel, I can always sense, I'm always stunned that people want to be seen, want to be photographed, want to be depicted, want to be heard. But yet, there is this responsibility. And so I wanted to at least be clear with myself why I was standing in this. And I saw that the two-prong sort of approach against the depiction of others, and Magnum photographers, for example, always had to deal with it, because an unspoken policy in Magnum is that if you're Iranian, you're photographing Paris. If you're French, you're photographing somebody in Tehran. So you're always doing it, and they did it for very good reasons, because you have a sharper eye when you are the other towards others, right? So, and so I started to read into that because I found myself in these various moral conundrums about that at least I wanted to be clear with myself. And one critique against, for example, something like Last Whispers I could see coming was, so they die. Good riddance. It's Darwin, and the strong wins, and the weak nature, it all goes, let them go. So, which is actually kind of a good old open, thing. And I actually prefer that than this, like, you can't do it because you have no right. Yeah. Because actually it feels like two different things. It's actually two different coins of the same silencing. And so Edward Said was very clear about how Orientalism was misread to actually do the silencing. And
so let's play this, because I want to talk about this theme of the other in Orientalism, both in your work and maybe this kind of conundrum of it's the problem of our time, the conundrum of our time. We're sitting within it when we sit in a museum. Right. Do you depict? Do you frame? Do you collect? Do you save? And what does that mean, and from what point of view? So yes, Said was such a huge figure in my education. Of course, everything surrounded this problematic. So let's actually hear from him. You gave us a nice clip.
And then others. Verb.
So yes, when I went to school in college and graduate school, probably the word most used, most problematic was this question of other. And we used in so many different ways, subject-object, the problematic of culture. You obviously have gone through that too. And I think
and I've gone through that on the ground.
Yeah.
Like you did with the museums, I did it among, processions in Guatemala or in Sevilla or in Tibet with the pilgrims in circumambulating Mount Kailash. You have to sort of think about that.
And what do you feel in that relation? You said you would know, because I know you well enough to know if somebody doesn't want to be photographed or captured, you do. There is a sense of that, right? And you can't ask for release forms and permission from everybody. But you had to come to that through thinking and through feeling and being in those circumstances, right? To
Yes.
come to this relationship to other, because you end up with this piece you've just done, kind of on the sensitive side, that to depict, to name, to hold, to feel, is an act of preservation, but life, right? That especially when you, I guess, recognize that there's a force against it, which somehow gives you more power to be on that side of other. Is that? Tell me more about your thing, because this is a big problematic. I mean, when I was going to school, it's like, can you work in a museum? Because it's an example of colonialism and the usurping of other.
We cannot undo genocides and wars and looting by empires within which we function, and we function within cultures that inherit these matters, the spoils, right? Now that we know all that, can we do anything? Well, when I did Last Whispers and showed it in the Living and Dying Gallery at the British Museum, the effect was interesting. So it was in London, in the Living and Dying Gallery, where the British Empire looted all the colonies and more.
The biggest example.
The figure standing in the middle was Hoa, the ancestor figure. From the Pacific Islands, from the Easter Islands. And from Alaska, there was a house pole. There were small golden boats from India, these beautiful objets d'art that are silent, standing there as they do in the museums. So we invaded it with Last Whispers. And an 8.1 sounding voices, as it turned out, from absolutely every part, every country that these objets d'art come from. And Londoners, also tourists, 80,000 people went through the show within 3 days alone. And they were shushing each other to hear them for a change. Now, this wasn't lost on our curator, David Sheldon. He knew very well what he was doing. He's a very sophisticated man thinking about the same things like you. Was it an intervention? I don't know, but it seemed not an intervention because it wasn't a big gesture. It was a haunting gesture for people. That's what the guards told me, and I love listening from the guards.
Yes, they know most.
They know most. Yeah. They're not brainwashed
Always.
by any preconceived ideas, and they are living and working every day among these great objects.
Yeah.
Culture.
Exactly. Well, so I just very quickly, I want to just everyone here to think about this obsession I see in your work of what's lost, the vanishing. There is an aspect to all of your work, and this series too, of things lost and the question of things lost. That absence, potential absence, and what one feels toward that, the idea to hold on to it. Of course, memory is part of that. I think this says it all in some way.
Stay here.
Yeah.
This is a very interesting, this is in the Vatican, in the catacombs. And this figure they call Il Professore. So there was a statue standing right there, and it was bolted into the wall. So these were like bolts that were going from the statue into the wall to keep it upright. And there was apparently this big gesture and figure. And some inscription debated among some people that apparently the Vatican had problems with.
They had to remove
They removed
sculpture.
it. And here this is. And he also looks like he's been gunned down. And I just love this picture and the story behind it.
Yeah, it's funny how we try to get to the thing by the leftover, the memory, the absence. I have this thing in museums. I don't take as many pictures of the objects as I take pictures of the shadows they cast, because I'm so familiar with museums. I get interested in like
Very
how do they
Plato
light
view.
it, and there's the shadow of the object, and then it's almost a memory trick for me to take the shadow and reconstruct the object, which this is more beautifully than any of mine, but says that question of how we try to get at things, the hardest things
Right.
to get at by having to work around and
Right.
not depicting directly all the time.
Right.
The object.
And photography is such a perfect medium of this sort of Platonic idea of catching the shadow cast, except of course it's a light reflected, but well, just
So-
the negative of that.
So
idea.
photography is also a kind of tool has been like the museum in its founding. Museums are founded on this sense of wonder, especially as they emerged at a moment when the world was getting smaller, that crazy things were being brought back from the Americas, and the courts of Europe were marveling at the difference in primitive cultures, and as they called them, or in different languages and all of that. So there's this, of course, aspect of the other. Other is boundary, what's inside, what's outside, what's over there, and also wonder that you've also been investigating in your work. So let's talk about that, the museum, the camera. I always describe, I know in history that the history of museums is almost coincident with the history of the camera, the museum as we know it, because it's the same impulse, right? To frame, to hold, to capture, to be able then to marvel at, to be able to categorize and organize. And the camera always had, like the museum, has this two-sided, isn't it fantastic to create wonder and curiosity, but at the same time, are we killing it in capturing it? And this series of photographs, this is the Lost Souls, right?
Right.
Yeah, from where you found your way to museum, to the Cabinet of Curiosity, and to these pictures which are utterly haunting, like your recent work, like the Last Whispers, but in a different way. So I'm curious about how you got to this through the doorway of museum and your early life.
I actually got it through the doorway of the classes in Latin. When I was studying language and literature, philologia, and linguistics somewhat, but in the discipline was called philologia, which I love, the love of language, philologia. And the philological faculty of Leningrad University, which stands in the Embankment River right across from Hermitage, stands also right next to the place called Kunstkamera. And that is the first museum in Russia, in the Russian Empire, founded by Peter the Great, the Russian Tsar. And one of the things that Peter the Great did was when he wanted to learn shipbuilding and how to build the Russian Navy, went to Holland and ran into the great anatomist Friedrich Rausch, who was the first one who could preserve the vanishing figure literally, anatomies, because, and he was doing it for the purposes of medicine, except of course, in those days, they weren't really distinguishing between, you know, medicine and art and sciences.
All things were one at that time.
It was all one, exactly. And so he would preserve this cyclops with 6 arms and all the birth anomalies that particularly were occurring because in those days they didn't know either about toxoplasmosis, the cat parasite influence, or that, you know, siblings shouldn't have children, things like that. Anyhow, and Peter the Great brings this collection on a ship to the place that's later is St. Petersburg and forms the first museum in the world, not in the world, in Russia, right then and there. And to seduce people, to bring in an audience because nobody's coming, he serves for free vodka.
We do that too.
And so anyhow, and there was always a joke among us that, you know, this is a spooky place with spooky things right next to us. And our professor of Latin would say, if you can't conjugate correctly, I'm going to pickle you and send you next door. So, he was a perfectly nice man, but that was his refrain. Anyhow, and one day I decided, well, hell, I'm just going to go and look because none of us actually went to look. And I remember coming up these marble stairs and these chandeliers, crystal chandeliers, and this glory of the, you know, this Russian imperial glory. And then you come into something that looks like a library and you see these creatures and then you see butterflies and bones of dinosaur bones that they thought were bones of giants, and maps are wild because, you know, all the boundaries are still being felt through.
That's right. Nothing better.
Yes, exactly. And I feel like my own boundaries are sort of start to fall apart. That there's all of a sudden, you know, the forms I had in my head just kind of collapsed. And there's something extraordinary when you see, you know, a stuffed pike and under it conjoined twins with 8 arms. You know, and it goes back to 17th century. You know, Damien had nothing on them.
Well, that is his source.
I know.
He's just redoing it.
Yeah, I know. Right.
For the art market in a larger world.
Yeah, exactly. So and it just lodged in my head.
So, but of course, that is so that sense of encounter, wonder, your own boundaries slipping. Because, of course, in this world we live in the 20th century, 21st century, it's a world of over-categorization, right? We're putting everything into boxes. That's what cameras and museums did over that century. Everything's in a box, everything's ordered, and I always feel like we threw the baby out with the bathwater in the sense that we've lost the connectivity that you feel actually in the voices of Last Whispers or in those cultures where, you know, culture, nature isn't so separate. Okay, the problem with this series is that we could spend 2 hours talking just about this work that you made, because you went, I mean, curiosity was a starting point, that was the intention, but your work is nothing about that, because your work is about, this work for me is about humanity. That somehow the whole idea of the other being weird or off norm, and you're looking right in it like a source of light, like a center of humanity, is so powerful. And I think that, yes, we'll be talking about this all day if we stick to this. So, but suffice it to say, in relation to this work, the new work, is that your willingness to see, I don't know, empathy is quite the right word, but your willingness to find the connection between inside, self, other, in a way that's, I think, transgressive to all the definitions that we learned in school about Orientalism and other. I think that's what you achieved in this work, is you've set a new paradigm for that connectivity, which we can talk about, literally the feeling of it. And now I do want to address this question too of photography. We talk about the origins of photography and how strange those origins are. Pyro, dawn of a medium, which is really worth talking about, because you're well documented in many interviews about how you don't like digital photography. And there's something about having the camera, and I know this, the sculpture, the physical material of the negative, because it's actually in layers. People don't realize the negative's not even on one layer. It's a physical thing in 3 dimensions. And then, so ironically, the next thing you're doing is virtual reality. The most digital, most futuristic. So let's talk about coming to that through your obsession with early photography.
The problems that I had with the digital photography is because it very quickly became really slick, really ironed out. What I love about Pyrogalal, and actually all the processes of the early photography, is for absolutely anti-sentimentalist reasons, but because of the reasons of the technology. At the dawn of the medium, the technology that emerges is full of wonder, full of possibilities, and also glitches and rough margins, because it's still figuring its way out. It's still not predictable. And for example, Ansel Adams loved Pyrogalal, but then he was such a control freak, he decided that he can't deal with it, because there were things that would be like, unpredictability in the patina. Sometimes it looks like a cat threw up on your negative, and it's very, very hard to control, because it's a very volatile medium. And its volatile medium is because they didn't quite gauge it yet. And yet at the same time, it's one of the most beautiful. And it has this intaglio, because the grain sticks to the outlines of the edges of the objects. And if you look at it under the microscope, for example, you actually see it looks like an etching. At the same time, it's highly photographic as well. So you see these beautiful gradient changes. And it could be, look at all the beautiful grays and just, variousness of it. And yet it could be completely, sharp and very black and white and very much like a charcoal painting.
Right, because the photography we study, when we study photography, we go, Ansel Adams sits there in the beginning because he made it scientific with a zone system and absolute predictability, both when you're making the photograph and then when you're printing the photograph. And you seem to be the person who seeks the glitch and the problem, always, right?
Not always. Sometimes I really mind it, I must say. But the payoff, is much more interesting, much better.
So take us to VR then, of your interest in going from interest in early photography, pyro, and all of that to, and this is actually at at the Kennedy Center.
At the Terrace Theater, the Kennedy Center this February, where we showed first the AV, the same work that showed yesterday at the Ford Theater, and then we showed the VR. And we showed it for the first time in history of VR at the same time to 500 people, synced performance. And the reason that VR fascinated me as a medium is because it's still in diapers. It's just in the beginning, and it has the same kind of glitches and irregularities and room for invention. So when I worked with Emblematic team, and my co-producers Cedric and Megan and Noni de la Peña, we were really trying to figure out how to make the idea come true and invent on the spot new coding with Jonathan Yamayusa, who was doing that at Emblematic. And there's still possibility to do this because it's not settled. So it has the same kind of...
So you sought that out. You also seem to willingly have taken yourself from the eye behind the camera. So much you, I think, that you barely ever use a tripod. Like you're always, that camera seems to be connected to you personally.
I have to take that last breath out, last exhale.
So it's part of you.
Yeah.
And then now you're leaping not only to a completely new digital technology with all of its glitches, but then you're adding more complexity because you're adding half a dozen or more collaborators. It's not all you.
Right. That was the hardest thing because, of course, I design my project, I shoot myself, I develop my own negatives, I print my own prints, I even have an easel to cut my own mats. And all of a sudden, I had to deal with, I think, over 200 linguists, language experts, archivists, 2 research, Teresa Schwartzman and Evelyn Villa. And then I had to bring in a whole team, animator Amanda Tasse, designer Maggie Morris, and then first and foremost, the sound designers, my composers, brilliant, brilliant guys, Marco Capalbo and Mark Mangini. So, all of a sudden, I had to deal with people as part of my process. And that was a difficult moment to be able to know where to delegate, where to leave room, and where to stop them, because I wanted that, ability in the rough margins to create beauty and snatch it away.
Which is elusive, right? So
It's
part of it is
elusive.
very strategic, I sense, because again, there's so much emotion. People will talk about your work, but the strategy, if you're going to stay creative, the elusiveness of getting at something around, you almost have to throw a wrench into your process as well.
Yeah.
To force yourself into some new space, the unknown.
And it's been the hardest thing to actually come back to the darkroom, 2 years I've been out of the darkroom. I have to pull myself back into, because it was actually liberating to do that. I love photography. I'll never give it up. I'll always do this. Where were we?
No, we were talking about throwing a wrench into things by changing your entire work process to work with all of these collaborators and then create something completely different, obviously, in a new technology.
Yeah. But also, I had to be honest with myself. I had to know that I'm not doing it to be tricky, to be new, because the idea, the project itself necessitated that particular medium.
Yeah, and I see that. It's not a positivist sense of innovation. It's a kind of tentative sense of questioning, to look around or I think find something else, right? It's not this sense of confidence of innovation. It's a questioning, investigation.
Yes, and also trying to be true to the idea itself, because it's very easy to have vanity. And to say, well, I'm just not going to performatively do something new for the sake of this performative action and, get myself a gold star. But I wanted to come from the beating heart of the idea. The beating heart of the idea of Last Whispers was silencing. How do you articulate an extinction, the form of which is silence? You sound what has gone silent. Obvious answer. How do you do that? You do it in such a way that you feel the presence, that you feel it in your head, in your brain, you feel them right next to you, whispering, chattering, singing to you. And so that you can't deny their existence. This cannot be denied. That they existed cannot be denied.
And somehow you're actually the vessel of its being once you've absorbed it. I do feel like if a lot of people, works of art are changed by being seen or experienced in this sense, because a work of art is never sufficient in itself, and every single person changes it. Like that idea of physics, the observed thing is changed. And I really think somehow that's that idea that if we have your work, if we have those voices, I feel like now I'm a receptacle or a carrier of some means of preservation, understanding, but in a way that's not, it's not like out there in a catalog, but somehow living.
Right.
The breath helps with that. I also love, so here are the pictures, by the way, of the British Museum, the Living and Dying Gallery, which could not have been a more appropriate place for your sound intervention, which was subtle, and they were very smart, because I think museums are always feeling that problematic of the thing lost, and that when you look, that's the most dramatic example, the Easter Island, because of course we know the extinction was just after. Right. And that all we have is the stone instead of the people.
Right.
And
funny enough, that picture is Hoa. That's Hoa, the ancestor figure. So not only the people were gone, the statue was stolen.
Right, and then the statue is stolen by the museum, so it's displaced in this other place. And whether the voices can, make up for that, I don't know. But I love this because you showed me that people were not only shushing the other visitors so that they could hear, but started like hugging and touching the sound.
That's right. They started to hug the
speakers.
The loudspeakers. Yes.
Which I really love. So I want to. So as we just now talk about to the piece itself directly, and we're going to show just a few clips. The empathetic vector, which is your made-up. I was like, is this a scientific term that I missed somewhere in my post-structuralist thinking? But no, this is yours, right? This vector, and that gets us to that point because. If I can, and you can talk about it, but we do have this sense of distance, the thing out there. And in the experience of the VR, the film, we get closer. But the key thing here to me is that when you're in the VR experience, unlike the museum, there's no frame. I mean, that must be what partly interested you in VR. It's the only kind of thing with no frame.
That's right, but also, you have almost godlike powers. You have to create the world from scratch, unless you are filming in VR with VR cameras. But if you're doing animation, and we did it with animation of Amanda Tasse and emblematic coding and reimagining it in virtual reality, you have to invent physics. Gravity is a massive issue. And you have to address gravity in VR. And how does it comport to our senses and our inner ear? And, so it's a massive other issue, the ethics in VR. That, you have to create a world in which, people, how are they propelled? Where does their will come in? Where is the agency? I mean, this is just massive and very fascinating philosophically issues.
Right. That we're just at the beginning.
We are just in the beginning. We're just beginning to think about all that. So, but for me, the solution for Last Whispers in VR was a fairly simple one. And when I was trying to explain it, because I don't have VR language, when I listen to, how I call them, my kids, Megan and Cedric, and Jonathan, they're very young and very talented. When I listen to them, I can hardly understand
what they're talking about?
What they're talking about, because it's, you know, full of abbreviations and, you know, different things, and I'm waving my hands trying to explain what we could do, what I want to do in it, and how do we find a common language. And I kept saying, this is an empathetic vector. What is it that I want to do in VR what we couldn't do in audio-video installation, the one that showed at the British Museum yesterday at the Ford? This complete immersion, this fulfilled immersion. And the fulfilled idea is actually a simple one. So in the VR that's now in the
at LACMA, in the study room,
yeah,
as you can see.
At the study room of the Building of the Americas, you see the planet, the globe, the little marble with voices chattering, singing, you know, that cloud of the others away from you, north of you, coming closer, closer, in front of you, around you, you. And so the exhale, it feels like you're the one making the last exhale. Whereas you begin the experience with the others far away from you. And so that's what I call an empathetic vector.
So it's so interesting.
Full
because,
identification. Sorry.
Yeah, because people talk a lot now about VR and empathy, and whether it can, and also just what you said about the early medium. There's the famous story that when film was new, you would walk into this theater and there would be a film of a train coming from the distance into you, and people would flee the theater in fear.
Right.
Because it was such a new medium and such a new experience that its verisimilitude was amazing. And I do find that in VR too now, because we're unfamiliar with it. It maybe has more power over our senses than maybe it will when we've digested it all. And somehow I think you took advantage of that notion of empathy, of anything pictured that has a verisimilitude, the newness of the medium, which attacks us also because it's unfamiliar, like the other. The medium itself is that. And for me, this idea of your breath or taking it within, this is like as if it's in you, is maybe the most transgressive from an art perspective, because you are actually trying to address this question of self and other by maybe thinking this new medium at its inception that addresses us differently can bridge that or create at least a different relationship to the inside-outside, perhaps.
Right, but I think that VR has and will continue to have this feeling of this awe.
Right.
And the really, truly great VR pieces like Notes on Blindness, which I think is like the King Lear of VR at this point, it has this, and it's a slow reveal. The dinosaurs running at you and the cars smashing in front of you and at you. I think it's stupid, and it will be dated so fast. And also a lot of even documentary VR, which has no reason to be VR, could be easily a documentary film or an essay, will also stop being made. We have to figure out what it is. What is the necessity to make VR? It has to be a VR. Right. It must be a VR. And when it must be a VR, there's an honesty about that. The necessity, shows, you feel that this isn't artificial, that there was a beating heart of an idea that necessitated that medium.
That is the big problem today, because now we're being bombarded with VR of all kinds, most of which, like I'm sure in early photography and everything, is nothing. It's just a redepiction. It's a demonstration. And that's why I think it's interesting that you have so many things working together in this piece. And maybe just to conclude, because we're going to show a few fragments, it's worth talking about the evolution of this, because you planned a text. That was your addressing this question of lost languages. Then you used your camera to maybe create images of those who spoke those languages. And then somehow it wasn't enough,
Right.
and you had to seek out a new medium.
That's right. First, it was an essay very long ago. I think still in Russia, I was making notes on it. I mean, I have notes on 54 projects about, and some of it in ideas, some of it is already shot and thought through. And I hold on because I can feel that there's more to it. I'm slow. But in this regard, this was very good that I wasn't successful in getting any grant. In 2003, I applied for every grant possible to create a portrait gallery of last whispers, of last speakers. And luckily, I didn't get them. But nobody supported on that project, and I needed support because I needed to go travel faraway places. And I kept listening to the recordings, which I could upload from public records of extinct and endangered languages. Many of these archives are public. And I would just upload them in my iTunes player and played them back to back in my darkroom while I was printing, my books, my shows. Darkroom is a great place to think. It's just you, the red bulb.
What else do you do?
And you listen, and I got haunted more and more and more and more by them. And then I realized that this was completely outside the bounds of a portrait gallery with, a few recordings sounding here and there, which was, one of the first iterations of that. And then I started to work with the team at MIT, trying to rig a forest, because they know how to rig a tree to transform it into a loudspeaker. And it actually trembles.
The haptic quality of the sound and motion together.
Exactly. And I started already to work with Mark and Marco on creating that sound design with those trees. And no arborist in the world would clear me. So I knew it was going to be an unfulfilled, beautiful idea. I have many unfulfilled, beautiful ideas. This wasn't.
We'll have
I didn't
a show
want to
of
have
those later.
Yes. So I brought the forest back into the work while I was doing the drone footage with Thomas, and so this was the plan. The plan was to. Is this the one that is on origins? Yes. I wanted to find
end at the beginning.
That's right. I wanted to find at least one origins myth among the extinct.
Among those languages.
Among
that are
those
extinct.
languages, yes. And I was working with many linguists, mostly with Mandana Simfidinipur, and so was the University of London Endangered Language Archive. And many, many people working in the field, and they would say, Lena, we're lucky if we get through the dictionary before it disappears, let alone
a story of such importance.
A story of such importance, exactly. But there was one that we got, and that was Tehuelche myth from Argentina, that all first humans were birds. There were ducks, flamingos, and swans. And when I found it, I just thought it was absolutely amazing. And that was going to be my only subtitle. And as a matter of fact, when you see that subtitle, that's actually what the last speaker, what she says. That is a literal translation at the time when she's saying it. And I wasn't going to go and find ducks to be so literal, that I was going to be above that.
That would be too romantic.
Too romantic, yes,
from your
exactly.
Scientific background.
And lo and behold, we are photobombed by a family of swans.
You couldn't avoid it.
I could not avoid it.
Okay, so we're just going to play some two clips.
Asham kawis kirkun tayro kekinos. Sair kchop kau kutsknem ke. Akin kam nikben maikvim. Ika wits mati hamten naite kokis. Okos ke yat. Ikinut ke. Goller matkamt. Golles ketensun erchen ke. Kawa kin kam buans kawa. Ilkam haast nou gaat kakao. Nou het kijkt gemnin. Jeek tske wannen.
Was met jou voor je? Gangen, jol, harur, pansperingen, putegnalakos, kulaniu mochor. Ngahori chongri, angor, hake, ungukere, olguilake, halgui lurt, pilgar kalara, pilon kalmot, tjufko, nonho, wat jabot, imkir nongdi, pihalach pilon kalmokota.
Ane kato la piyon kuas manta manit la kor kuas man klem para on la kor kato ko yuko klem para on la kor wete te kuat la plats ko on conejo antro chico yuko tagampo gemete te ayune kualane kuas que me cha kualane ko yuko
Govan ne jump naman kudubok kangal. Man boy na mine push swingan. Am Govan girum am cry. Tego motiara. Tam singat na tawa sleep na naram. Dat girum akandabo.
So then we have the swans photobombing. I love that idea that you didn't want to have swans or birds and you couldn't help it. And of course, this piece is all about sound.
It's mostly about sound. Yeah.
The languages certainly are sounded, they're present. But of course, you had musical collaborators as well, because you have...
Well, how does language live? Language lives in speech, in script, and in song. And a lot of languages actually that have no script have a lot of songs and incantation. And that's how they pass the stories about each other and about themselves through song. Those are some of the most evocative, actually, languages. Some of the languages, including the one that we had at home, actually had the most beautiful script. It's an endangered, critically endangered language, and it's just gorgeous, gorgeous script. By the way, I think we have a clip of it. Not here, not in this presentation, but we have a separate clip if we want to show it. But it was very clear that it was going to be a form of sorts, the name for which I didn't have, ironically, because it's a work about language and I ran out of words to define it, because I was trying to really stay true to the idea of incantation of the languages that are gone extinct, and to bring them to life as much as possible. And yet it needed, of course, to have some sort of a form. And I thought the best is oratorio, not a requiem, a lyrical oratorio. It also, I mean, first of all, I had a very clear idea that I didn't want it to be the final thing. And if anything, as I said yesterday, if it's going to be an oratorio, it has to be the Verdi oratorio, you know, this kind of a challenge to oblivion. And actually, at the end, the piece that Mark Mangini designed, it actually is like that, the challenge. It's during the washing machine. Quote unquote. Anyway, but we'll get to the washing machine later. But the first idea that I had was to have two composer sound designers. No, first one. And, sorry, I needed to find one. And I came down to Mark Mangini and Marco Capalbo, and I knew that Marco was going to be really like a Stravinsky, which is creating this kind of sound landscape that is both haunting but disjointed and Stockhausen-like or John Cage-like or Stravinsky-like. You know, this was going to be some kind of rites of spring. And Mark has a completely different proclivity, and that is the sort of similar to mine, which is holding on to things, and very much like a Rachmaninoff. And I thought, how am I going to choose? And it was going to be either one or the other. And then I realized, well, actually, this is both, because we wanted to, first of all, show the personal story. Because, of course, every last speaker, it's a life. It's, you know, you want to show that. And these were going to be the arias. That's what Mark created. But also the sort of planetary scale of extinction. Of course, you know, we know that at least one language dies every 2 weeks. This is a mass extinction. There is no question about that. So it cannot be just, you know, these warm arias that go one after another after another. There had to be a break, and that's what I realized, that that's actually perfect to have both of these guys, right? And the most important and difficult task then was how to put it together, how to put these bits, these musical bits that they were doing using the recordings. It's a scored piece. They don't change the recordings themselves. But using the recordings, they wrote a score. And so, and here you can really feel, this is Mark's. And here comes Marco's.
Wow. You gave me one last clip that I definitely want to play. I know we're over time, but you're right that it's not just about sound, because there's so much that's about image and how you structure image in this three-dimensional, immersive, and I would say even interior space. And it's so fitting to kind of end on a question that you brought up, the glitch or the mistake, which is one of the things I love about your work in this, in that one of the most arresting visual images was an accident. Right?
I worked with this brilliant animator, Amanda Tasse, and she's a perfectionist. So at some point when we were doing the finale, she said, "Oh my God, we have to redo this thing because the layers are going in the different directions and at different speeds. And sorry, don't look at it." And I looked at it, and it was like, "Oh my God, stop." Stop.
Keep that.
We keep that, and we call this the washing machine. And that's when there is a crescendo. This is the kind of the moment, that famous moment that I absolutely love in Verdi's Requiem, which is, like a swear to God, a challenge. And in a way, I think Mark kind of composed something that's, I think, really similar to that. With the recordings and building up the crescendo. And that's when the washing machine that we did.
So I just want to say that just in conclusion, that this is an amazing thing. It is a new form of art. You've used it in its nascent form to do things that who knows if it will do again, because I agree with you that the beginning of a medium maybe allows for things that are completely different. And the whole piece is so amazing for me in that idea of the distant and yet inside to the breath. I also think the other last amazing thing about it is that, knowing a little about you and your history, that it's about the world, time, history. It is a museum in a way, without frame, because it holds these languages for us to feel. But you passed quickly by that story at the beginning when we started talking about your own upbringing and losing language, because you started in Russian, you wanted to be a writer for circumstances we won't go, you spoke English then, and between that, you lost complete mastery of either, and that was a personal loss somehow. And that you've taken that very personal thing, and I think spun it out to humanity again. I think is incredibly beautiful and a gift to all of us. And I just think it's wonderful. Thank you for taking the time with us. I don't know if Olga's here from the Ford, but it was so great to collaborate with the Ford, to have your work shown there and then to have the VR here. And I think we're actually just at the beginning of thinking about this work of yours. So thank you so very much.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming.
And thank you all for being here.